Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to our Oxfam Live on vaccine inequality. My name is Siham Rial. I am the Women's Rights Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Oxfam Canada, and I'll be your host for this conversation today. We want to recognize that Oxfam Canada and acknowledge that Oxfam Canada and our offices are located on the unceded, unsurrendered traditional territories of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsuli-Waututh peoples. We recognize the privilege of operating on lands that these peoples have nurtured since time immemorial. As guests on these lands, we commit to walking in solidarity with our host nations and according to Oxfam's values of equality, empowerment, solidarity, inclusiveness, accountability, and courage. We have a robust conversation coming up with our two speakers, followed by a Q&A, where we're going to be inviting viewers to submit their questions through the chat. So we do hope and expect this to be a very lively conversation. We do have our colleagues, Amanda Gom and Cassandra DeFreitas, that are helping us behind the scenes in bringing this conversation to you today. Oxfam Canada is a part of the People's Vaccine Alliance, which is a growing movement of health and humanitarian organizations, past and present world leaders, faith leaders, and economists, pushing governments for fair and equitable access to a COVID vaccine, and that a COVID vaccine must be widely available for everyone in all countries, free of charge. For us here at Oxfam Canada, we've been pushing the Canadian government to support a waiver on intellectual property rights and patents being proposed by India and South Africa at the WTO. I hope after our conversation, you feel inspired to take up the call to action on vaccine inequality. We are asking Canadians to send a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau, letting him know that Canada must support the ever-growing calls to suspend intellectual property and patents so we can scale up vaccine manufacturing. Since the first vaccines became available, we've seen the distribution of these vaccines highly skewed towards rich countries. And to date, 1.18 billion doses have been administered. 83% of those have gone to wealthy countries, and low-income countries have so far received less than 1% of available doses. The situation in India is a tragic reminder, and that vaccine ecosystem that we're all a part of is broken. Before this pandemic, 60% of global vaccines were made in India, and the country is a critical pipeline for COVID vaccines for low-income countries. But India is facing shortages of the ingredients needed to produce more COVID vaccines for its citizens and is held back by patents and licensing deals that is making it difficult to be able to produce this life-saving medicine. At the same time, we can see that pharmaceutical companies have profited enormously from this crisis. Pfizer profits are estimated to date at $3.2 billion just from the COVID vaccine. And this is another example of why we need a people's vaccine to end this pandemic. But of course, you're not just going to be hearing from me. So we're privileged to have two dynamic speakers with us today. Fatima Keller is a senior policy specialist on women's economic rights at ActionAid UK as a Nigerian-born and Irish-British Pan-African feminist. She is a part of the NAWI AfroFem Macroeconomics Collective. She has 20 years of experience engaging in feminist advocacy, research, and analysis on economic justice and empowerment. ActionAid UK has been very vocal in support of vaccine equity and is also a member of the People's Vaccine Alliance. Archana Rampur is the CUPE National Director of Research of job evaluation and health safety, and has led CUPE's political action work in the past. CUPE is the largest union here in Canada and represents many healthcare workers, first responders, and other frontline workers. So join me in welcoming Archana and Fatima to the discussion. Hi. How are you doing? Well, we're
Hi, we're
really,
doing well. Thank you. I'm well.
well, we're really excited to have this very timely conversation. And we're not going to ignore the news that came out of the US yesterday, obviously. And I think that's going to be an undertone and an undercurrent of why we really need a waiver on patents on intellectual property rights, intellectual property. Around vaccines. But let's get to the first part of our conversation. So we know that the statistics are clear, right? 1 in 4 people in rich countries have received a vaccine so far. And by now, only 1 in 500 people in poorer countries have received vaccines. How did we get to this, and what is the problem? We'll start with Fatima.
I'm off mute. That's good. Thank you very much. Well, I think, the statistics sort of says it for itself, but how did we get to it? Well, there is a huge imbalance, as you have said already, in who has, available vaccine doses, with high income countries having secured, I believe, about 5 billion doses, and low to middle income countries having less than 3 billion. That's despite the fact that that latter grouping make up about 85% of the world's population. So essentially, the doses that are being produced are not affordable for low-income countries in particular. But wealthier countries were already stockpiling vaccines, in the early parts of the year. So in February, for example, one report indicated that the world's richest countries had already monopolized over half of current and projected doses. And calculations from that indicated that the excess of those doses would have been enough to vaccinate the entire adult population in Africa. So, we have two primary problems here. One is that higher production levels are needed, and this can only be done if those who currently have the knowledge on approved vaccines are willing to share that knowledge in order to scale availability, but they're not willing to share at the moment. And two, the vaccines produced must be affordable for all countries to be able to afford them beyond the global north. So that's essentially what we need. And in order to get that production to scale, to get affordable pricing, allocated at a global level, deployed locally, all of this needs to happen, but essentially it's not happening so far. So this is the problem from my perspective.
We couldn't agree more. I think since this crisis began, we've seen sort of these two worlds emerging, particularly those that could afford to get a vaccine as quickly as possible, and those that are going to be waiting, years to be able to get their first dose or even have full mass immunization for their population. So, Archana, what are your thoughts here?
Let me start by saying thank you for having me. This is a privilege to be here on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and I am struck by how much we have conversations like this in moments of global crisis. We had this around the HIV/AIDS crisis, and now we're having it over the COVID crisis. But the roots of this, the inequality, the unequal access to medications, essential life-saving medications, goes back a lot longer than that. The world has been held hostage by big pharmaceutical companies who have intellectual property rights that are protected by the World Trade Organization. And as Fatima said, this is a question of supply and a question of distribution. It's not necessarily a question of ethics or fairness or even what actually is best for all of the people in the world. If we can get to a point where we can distribute locally the medical supplies, the medical, the vaccines, but not just vaccines, medical supplies that are so desperately needed in the world, we would have a much healthier planet. And I think we have to start with that. We have to start by acknowledging that the monopoly and the hoarding of essential medications has had and will continue to have a huge impact on so many populations in so many different parts of the world.
And I think, it seems oftentimes when people ask the question about how did we get here, and part of it is that we weren't prepared for this pandemic, globally. And in not being prepared, I think we've allowed inequality, global inequality, to continue to fester and shape the world that we live in, to accept that there will be a group that can access a vaccine because they can pay for it really quickly, i.e. many wealthy countries, and those that, you know what, it's just you're going to have to wait your turn. And I think this pandemic and vaccine issues of vaccine inequality have really brought that to the forefront. So I want to kind of move on to the next conversation, which is to ask specifically about the two things that you've both raised about the demand outpacing the supply. And so we know that vaccine supplies are precarious everywhere, but of course, poorer countries are hardest hit. What do you think are the solutions needed to address rising vaccine inequality? So we'll start with Archana.
Sure. Again, there are so many solutions to this, but the crux of this is that we need more local production in all of the different regions of the world that makes vaccines. And again, I want to go back to repeating, it's not just vaccines, but all of the different kinds of medications that are necessary to deal with COVID right now. They need to be produced locally. That will make them cheaper, that will make them easier to distribute to the hotspots. And we need to change our mindset globally from this notion of protecting trade monopolies. We need to get to a point where we understand that more for me does not have to mean less for you, because we're stuck in this vicious circle where all of the rich countries are buying up all of the supply they can, which leaves, as you said, the poorer nations of the world battling for vaccines and medical supplies that they simply, one, can't access, and if they can access, are paying extraordinarily expensive rates for them. One of the things that I'm always blown away by is that Canada is paying less for vaccines than South Africa is paying for vaccines right now. And that seems like such an unfair position to put these global South countries into.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And this is a great segue into talking about the economics of vaccine supply and distribution and manufacturing itself. There's so much, there's a huge lack of transparency with these agreements, these bilateral agreements and deals that pharmaceutical companies have made with some of the wealthier countries. And I think we have to break down those systems to be able to really hone in on where the monopolies lie, and just how predatory I think pharmaceutical companies are in the way that they have a monopoly over pricing medicines, the distribution, the supply chain networks, the distribution of them, etc. So Fatima, if I can bring you in as our feminist economist to give us a bit more insight on that.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do first actually is speak a little bit to what I think Archana has given sort of what the solution is. And I think it's very important for us to know what the solutions that are being proposed by our governments who are, refusing to sign the waiver, and those who just generally, are in opposition to the waiver, are saying, we'll do the job. So, at the moment, there are several global initiatives in place in order to try and get vaccines to developing countries. There are 3 of these primarily. So there's the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, known as the ACTA. There's the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, known as CTAP, and the Vaccine Pillar, which is COVAX. Now, CTAP is meant to facilitate the sharing of knowledge, but currently there's been no collaboration in the uptake from pharmaceutical companies, and it's been basically low to non-existent. And for COVAX, there's a significant funding gap to meet this target. So even when we include the surplus of stockpiles, there's nothing sufficient there to ensure that vaccines are deployed rapidly enough to save as many human lives as possible. That facility is also heavily dependent on supplies from India, and given the situation there, vaccine exports have been halted. So this whole issue of needing to bring it back as close to the local level as possible is absolutely critical, and there really aren't any decent arguments against this. The COVAX facility is also limited to the capacity of existing manufacturers as it is right now, which will not address the issue of supply. So when we think about it, current projections for COVAX, based on what's going into that facility, suggest that Africa, for example, will only be adequately supplied by the end of 2023. And this is absolutely critical for us to be able to understand how, these are the solutions that we are being told instead of the waiver. We need to understand these and their limitations in order to essentially be able to fight back. And in terms of the waiver itself, I mean, I could sort of start to go into that now, and what that then means from, from an economic perspective, but more specifically what that means from an operational perspective. Let me know if you'd like me to do that now or at a later stage.
No, I think this is a perfect segue into the trips. I know that it's really interesting because there's been a slow, in the beginning it was quite slow when Oxfam Canada was advocating on the TRIPS waiver issue. We felt that there was a knowledge gap that we had to fill about what is TRIPS, right? And why is a waiver being proposed, and why is it needed and necessary? So I feel like we've continued to bridge that gap and to bring, more people on board to say, listen, this is an issue that you need to care about, and it's going to impact your life on a daily basis, particularly when we talk about access to medicine. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the TRIPS waiver being proposed at the World Trade Organization. What is being proposed, and, why do you believe this could have a huge impact? We'll start with Fatima.
Okay, so essentially, let's be aware that what was proposed in October 2020 may not be what we end up with. So that's very critical. So India and South Africa, tabled a proposal in October 2020, and this has been eventually backed by over 100 countries within the WTO and a whole bunch of Nobel laureates and ex-world leaders, etc. And it called for a temporary suspension of certain provisions within TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement within the WTO, which has been around as long as the WTO has been around, and which very critically we should know was drafted with the help of pharmaceutical companies. I think it's important to know that. And so they've asked for a suspension of these provisions relating to copyrights, industrial design, patents, protection of undisclosed information, essentially all towards the idea of ramping up production in diagnostics, medicines, and vaccines across countries. So not just the vaccine, also medicines, therapeutic medicines, which are critical to, essentially surviving from COVID. So critically, this would allow vaccines to be produced at a more affordable price, removing the stranglehold that the dominant companies currently have on vaccine pricing and medicinal pricing. However, what the waiver is going to eventually look like could be a different matter if it's, ever signed, in fact. So yesterday, we know the WTO met, and this was on the table. And since then, my understanding is, from sort of news trickling in and out, is that India and South Africa are actually talking about revising the proposal. Right. So we already see that, there has been some shift there. And this, of course, coincides with the news from the US yesterday that the Biden-Harris government is willing to support a waiver. So a key thing to note here, they are open to engaging, so this is from the text of their statement, in text-based negotiations on a waiver of IP on the vaccine at the WTO, but there is no commitment there. So there's a vagueness there as to whether the waiver there will also be a waiver on associated technologies needed to produce the vaccine. So essentially everything is still to play for now, in terms of associated technologies, what we're talking about here, the equipment needed, cold storage systems, for example, for the vaccine. There's also other stuff, like non-patent intellectual property, which includes manufacturing know-how, test data, all of that is needed in order to make this work. And there are also, various steps needed in order to make this not effective. And so you need significant investment to accelerate vaccine production. You need, very clear technology transfers. So we need loosening of IP, not just on the compounds of the vaccine itself. Tech transfers are going to require a lot of collaboration. And, based on what we've seen so far, the will is not there. The WHO has this COVID-19 technology transfer hub, and governments need to put their weight behind ensuring that that collaboration actually takes place. In terms of the impacts of the waiver, I mean, we cannot state enough how much developing countries are carrying such an immense burden in terms of the challenges of this pandemic. The global northern countries can only even begin to imagine, and that's despite what we know we have all been through, within the global north. Health systems are collapsing. We're seeing this vividly in the Indian, in India, but it's happening across different countries as well, albeit at a different, scale. So we're talking about strains, of insufficient equipment, prolonged strain on health workers, in already understaffed situations, prolonged exposure to the virus, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder level experiences of death and illness faced by health workers. Economically, the pandemic has been catastrophic. Africa is facing its first recession in 25 years. As a feminist, I always apply that feminist lens to it, which is not just about women, but obviously has that gender divide as a starting point, but across all marginalized groups and oppressed groups. But, women traders, for example, in the informal economy, which, a continent like Africa is so heavily dependent on, have been on the front line throughout the pandemic, in order to supply the essential needs and guarantee a level of, basic food security in many of our countries on the continent. And their continued exposure as a result of vaccine inequality will continue to place their lives and those of billions in danger. We know what all of the other impacts of the lockdown have been: increased levels of violence against women, so successive waves of the pandemic from now until 2023 or 2024 means successive lockdowns, successive impacts. So a comprehensive waiver, along with all those other considerations that are needed that I've mentioned, will lead to an increased production and a more equitable distribution to actually bring a halt. Here in the UK, where I currently am, people are out in the streets, doing their thing because we have already reached such a high level of vaccination. And, global northern countries, many of which actually mismanaged the pandemic, over the last year, and the UK is one that has been accused of that. The US as well is returning to that well sought after normal, whilst developing countries, which did not have that same level of mismanagement, possibly because of not the same level of impact, are now going to essentially soak up the impacts for far more years than we have ever had to endure as a result of this unbelievable inequality in terms of supply and distribution, as Archana has said.
And I think, Fatima, that I couldn't have said it better, honestly. And I think what you've pointed to that needs to resonate with so many people is the disruption that this has had on the everyday life of so many poor communities and poor societies, because the economic disruption, the social disruption, the political impacts and ramifications that are going to come from not adequately, racing to vaccinate as many people as possible. So I want to bring Archana in to add another dynamic to this. So we know the need for this waiver. Fatima laid it out for us. The economic impacts, are going to be crippling as waves of lockdowns continue. But there's also been opposition to this waiver. And one argument being made is that pharmaceutical companies need to protect their patents to support and provide incentives when developing, new technologies. So we know that nearly $100 billion of, we know $100 billion of public money went into vaccine development, and we saw 26 billion paid out to shareholders of pharmaceutical company shareholders. So what's your response to that argument, Archana?
Sure, and thank you for raising that point, Siham, because it's really important for us to know that there has been an ongoing battle with pharmaceutical companies about the need for them to make the kinds of record profits they have made in the last 3 decades. And this is the classic argument they always employ. They say, oh, well, we need to protect our patents. We need to charge high prices. We see this in Canada, even in terms of non-COVID, non-emergency times. The high prices that pharmaceutical companies charge in Canada, way higher than they charge in many other places in the world, are set up as a mechanism for them to extract the most amount of money from the public in terms of getting payouts for their medications. But you're absolutely right to point out the amount of resources that go into research and development, the public resources. If you look at the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the recipe, if you like, was actually developed by Oxford University, fully publicly funded. Almost 97% of the funding for it was public. And beyond that, even when you get to the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the components of those vaccines have been long studied in public institutions. The speed of the vaccine might make people think that Moderna and Pfizer, engaged in this incredible amount of research and they produced these new vaccines that were never heard of in the world before. That's not actually true. What they did was they took lots of basic research that had been funded by public institutions over the last 20, 30 years and pieced it together and tested it against COVID. That is one of the reasons why we have had the COVID vaccine, created, tested, and received approval so fast. But what it also means is that a lot of the research that went into the building of the COVID vaccine was publicly funded. When you have private corporations, giant pharmaceutical corporations, transnational corporations engage in research, what they spend their money on is on research that leads to the development of Viagra, because that is a cost generator for Pfizer. That has been the biggest cost generator for Pfizer before the COVID vaccine. They don't go out and spend their money creating basic research that leads to breakthrough medications and vaccines for diseases that are prevalent mostly in the global south, for exactly the reasons Fatima outlined. If we'd had the kind of investment from these big research companies over the last 30 years, we would have had vaccinations and medications that are far more effective for diseases like malaria, which are huge killers in the global south. We don't have that because they do not have an incentive to do the kind of research that goes into the development of actually necessary essential medications. You can't have a profit-driven corporation or a set of corporations that are allowed to set the parameters of global solutions. Capitalism isn't going to get us out of this pandemic.
I couldn't agree more. But the next question is, what responsibility do you think that Canada has to tackle vaccine inequality? We know that many Canadians would say we need to consider ourselves first. So what would be the kind of, why would this kind of approach backfire when we only consider ourselves? So Archana and then Fatima.
Sure. There are two basic reasons for why we should act on this. And Fatima has done such an amazing job of outlining the moral and the ethical case for why the world needs to move on the TRIPS patent protections. I'll make the more economic case for Canadians, because we are talking to a mostly Canadian audience, I think. If we want to live in a world where we can have the kinds of privileges we have had in the past, if we want a world in which we can travel freely, if we want a world in which we will not be at risk of continuous further lockdowns because a new variant has appeared that has, that has been born in a country where transmission rates have gone through the roof because they have no access to the vaccines necessary, then we will be at risk. There's no virus that respects a national boundary, right? Diseases become pandemics precisely because in the kind of globalized world we live in now, there are no ways to protect just within our nation states. We need to have a solution for COVID that is accessible universally, that is accessible to the poorest countries where people live in the most crowded conditions with the least access to healthcare. Because if we don't have that, we will have another wave and another wave and another wave, and different variants will come up, and some of them will be vaccine resistant or vaccine escape variants. So far, we have been really lucky that most of the variants that have broken through have not been vaccine escape variants. And by that, I mean that the vaccines we have are generally fairly effective against those variants. But that's not going to continue to happen if we let the poorer countries of the world, if we let them suffer through endless waves of unregulated transmission. So that's the self-interest argument here too.
Yeah, I like what you said, diseases become pandemics. And I think we've really woken up to just how quickly this virus spread and how interconnected we really are. So Fatima, I know you're based in the UK, and the UK's experience with the initial onslaught of this virus. If you could speak a little bit to that and just sort of why, this me first approach just isn't going to get us out of this crisis.
So for laid out, it's a fallacy. It's a false idea of what Me First is, because ultimately, the pragmatic reasoning that Archana has given will render it all ineffectual in the end because of the emergence of variants. But also there's an importance actually to pull our governments up on what they say and what they're doing. So, they speak the ethical and moral language very well, and they do that as leaders of the G7, which the UK currently is, and a variety of other different roles that they play, the various mandates that they have held up to, they have signed themselves up to. And it's really important that we are able to actually pull them up on that. I'm not going to say to illustrate to them how it's contradictory, because I think they are aware. I think to actually hold them accountable for that. So we can see everything that is starting to go backwards in those countries that are being impacted so deeply. And the real impacts have yet to even be felt in many low and medium income countries. They will be felt in the years to come. And so all of these mandates that we have, the SDGs, etc., are going to be far harder, and they are even being rolled back now, and many of our countries have signed up to whole commitments on gender equality, for example, that is being cut away at as we speak as a result of this pandemic. Women are constantly on the forefront of precarity in every aspect of their lives, and any kind of crisis, economic, health or otherwise, they feel it the most deeply. So that alone, from the perspective of pragmatism, as well as those realities of the talk, that they say, let them walk it. They need to be able to do this for that reason, because ultimately this comes down to an issue of imbalance in power. It's an deep-rooted power imbalance between those countries we call the global north and those countries we call the global south, and how that imbalance has rendered to a large extent Black and brown bodies expendable in the face of corporate interests. They need to be held accountable for that.
And if I can, Siham, just jump in on that.
Please.
One of the things that I think is so infuriating to me as a Canadian is that I got my AstraZeneca vaccine a couple of weeks ago. My vaccine was made in India. Our Prime Minister, who, as Fatima has said, is one of the people who likes to talk the talk a lot, got his AstraZeneca vaccine about the same time that I did. And I think there's a huge chance that his vaccine was also manufactured in India. Canada was one of the countries that paid into the COVAX initiative and then took 1.9 vaccines, AstraZeneca vaccines made in India, and imported them into Canada. We have absolute evidence here that there are countries in the global south that have the ability to produce vaccines safely. We know that the reason they cannot vaccinate their populations safely and as fast as we can is because they simply do not have the economic power that we have. There's something so incredibly racist about pharmaceutical companies and people like Bill Gates artlessly making the argument that, it's not just a question of waivers, it's the fact that they don't have the know-how or the capacity to produce these vaccines. I'm sorry, that's just incredibly, words fail me at this point, because the words I want to use I probably shouldn't use on this webinar. But we need to understand how incredibly unbelievable that line of reasoning is. And we in these countries of the global north have a responsibility to ensure that our leaders don't just talk the talk and talk about, we're gonna do our best. We're gonna send our excess supply of vaccines to the countries that have been hit the hardest in the global south. Vaccine charity is not a substitute for patent justice. What we need to do is create a model of world cooperation where this doesn't have to be fought. And it doesn't have to be fought on the bodies, as Fatima has said, of Black and brown children and women primarily, but also men in nations of the global south. We need to have a system where poor countries don't have to come to the WTO asking, begging and pleading for temporary suspensions of patents during a global crisis. There are many global health crises that are going on all the time, where if we had patent justice, if we had different forms of intellectual property rights, those health crises would not bloom to become the pandemics that they will become if we don't address them.
I mean, you said it, we need justice, not charity. So I'm conscious of the fact that we could have the conversation between us, you know, for as long as, like, at least I would like, but we do have a couple of questions and I'm grateful for that. So I'll get to the first question. Lawrence asks, if the intellectual patent rights are waived, as now seems to be on the cusp of happening, what are the producing companies and countries around the world in a position to do this locally? I think who, yeah. And how can they lower cost production in such short order? Which it is really, I think it's a great question because it pulls exactly off of the last bits of the conversation that both Archana and Fatima, both of you that have been speaking on, and just sort of even the colonial undertones of the way of the injustices that are embedded in our current global economic system. So, you know, what are the producing companies and countries around the world in a position to do this, to support, you know, I think local manufacturing and vaccine ramp up, and how can they lower cost production in such short order? So Fatima, do you want to address that?
Yes, thank you very much. So, you know, Archana has already spoken to the fact that there are countries out there that can produce, and, you know, there are countries, I think, in various regions that are able to do that. But one of the things that we also need to be clear on is that I've heard a lot of pushback on the fact that India is producing a lot of these vaccines. And actually, the whole issue here is not which countries are producing, it's the ownership of the IP around it. So India, if this IP waiver is actually, you know, goes ahead, can produce the vaccines themselves far more cheaply, and with its proximity as well to other global southern countries, would be able to get that local production quickly. So when we're talking about ramp up, you know, a country like India that has the facilities, that has the manufacturing in place and can very quickly get going, would actually be one of the countries that could do this. So I think it's very important for us to look at it from that perspective as well, because, you know, when you go into social media, you see so much, you know, sort of backlash towards India. Well, if they're producing it, why are there people dying, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be able to understand these arguments just as well, I think.
And I think understand maybe the interconnectedness of of trade, right? And that really and truly prior to this pandemic, and I said this in the intro, that India was providing on regular 60% of the world's other vaccines, other than this COVID vaccine, which is what made, you know, the Serum Institute so prime to hold that license with AstraZeneca. This might be getting into sort of what the difference between a voluntary and a compulsory license is, but we can have that. But I want Archana to kind of weigh in on this question.
And just if I may, there are two major vaccine manufacturing facilities in India that those of us who are nerds on this topic have heard of. Serum Institute, Zihan is one of them. The other one is Bharat Biotech. But I want to point out that there are problems with this too, because these, again, are both private corporations within India. What has happened is that they are the only people who have these licensing agreements, as you mentioned. But we need lifting the patent waivers would mean a lot more production in a lot of other facilities as well as in India, as you said, because we need to create many production facilities in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean, and we need to have these local hubs of production so we can have much shorter supply chains, much easier distribution chains. And that is a key part of this, I think. The other thing that I do want to emphasize is that, yes, Biden has come out with this half-hearted, maybe let's talk about maybe potentially possibly supporting the waiver, and then India and South Africa have clearly felt pressure, and so they're already sort of rewording their proposals. So I expect to see major concessions from them on this too. But I also want us to note that Angela Merkel, from Germany, has just come out in the last couple of hours opposing the US initiative, I guess. And in the meantime, in the 16 hours between Biden's administration saying, yeah, we're kind of open to it, the stocks of Moderna and Pfizer fell. And then Angela Merkel comes out an hour before and says, well, you know, we really have issues with that. We don't think this will help. These stocks of the global stocks for Pfizer and Moderna rise again. There is a huge corporate interest in this. And that's why it can't be solved by, you know, these two industries, these two production facilities in India actually manufacturing more vaccine. We need to liberalize the actual production capacity and expand it beyond the two licensed facilities.
This is a great segue. So we've got another really good question, and it's a great segue to it, and I want to get to it. Despite yesterday's announcement of U.S. support for some sort of patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines, I can't help but feel like we need to wait and see what will look like in practice. We should be monitoring as this potential patent waiver moves forward to push for the broadcast and for the broadest life-saving waiver possible. Also, when would you expect Canada to follow suit? That's, yeah, talk about being put on the spot. So Fatima, I want to get your take on this in terms of really what should we be monitoring as this potential waiver moves forward? And do you think that we know that the text is being currently revised by India and South Africa? We don't expect it to be as broad as the text that was proposed in October. So what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
So where Canada is concerned, I can't really speak on that because I don't know the Canadian situation as well. To be honest with you, where the UK is concerned, it's very difficult to say because on the one hand, we have a very dominant conservative government that's currently in power with a huge majority and has essentially sort of been able to move through with, you know, almost every position it has with very little, without really having to turn to civil society or public opinion more broadly on certain issues. But then at the same time, we also know that the relationship between the US and the UK is immensely important. So we're just going to have to wait and see. This has been a huge sort of shifting phase for everybody in terms of the way they engage with the US anyway. In terms of, you know, asking for the broadest waiver possible, that is what we have to do. Because actually, you know, and this is what I think some people don't want to hear, this is about much more than COVID. The COVID vaccine, you know, as we've already mentioned, it's also about other medicines that are needed, but we've been here before. This is about ensuring that we are not here again. So when I say we've been here before, I'm referring to, you know, the AIDS epidemic and, you know, what South Africa had to go through at that time in order to ensure that its population was able to access ARVs, which the TRIPS agreement was effectively preventing from you know, increasing access to. And, you know, and it took an incident where, as a result of an anthrax outbreak in the US, which led to the waiver, so they can be waived, on some antibiotics, which eventually led to a loosening of the ARV waiver. And so, you know, we've really got to be able to understand what the arguments are and how flawed they are, and the importance of getting this right now so that we do not find ourselves here again, even in 10 years' time. Let's say we did somehow, you know, beat this in the next 3 to 4 years, and we've got millions, possibly, you know, more dead as a result of going ahead with just the COVAX facility and whatnot. We will be back again in another 10 to 15 years because that's what history has shown us. And, you know, what can be done there? Well, we've got to be able to organize around these arguments. I think it's absolutely critical, you know, and I think we should be calling for the broadest waiver possible. And, you know, our governments should be, you know, should be engaging with this far more than this half-hearted approach that we have seen. But actually, you know, as a call out to global Southern governments as well, you know, India and South Africa are going back to the drawing board perhaps, or they're going to make some revisions here and there. But, you know, the concessions is something that we do need to be monitoring. And I think we should push back as a global community as much as we can in order to support India and South Africa from some of the compromises they will be forced to take.
And again, Canadian perspective, we're not manufacturing COVID vaccines here either, right? And it's because exactly for the same reason, we're not manufacturing them because we don't have the production capacities. Canada could probably license some of the vaccine production here if we had retained our national vaccine and essential medication manufacturing capacities. Well, we didn't. Successive federal governments, liberal and conservative, basically sat back and watched our own local manufacturing capacity disappear. And now we are in the same position. And that's one of the reasons why Canada, even though we have been the country that has hoovered up the most number of vaccines per population, we're still behind a number of other nations in our vaccine rollout. And there's a lot of and justifiable anger in Canada about that. But again, we need to recognize that the reason for that is because we as a country for the last 20, 30 years have silently sat back and let our own manufacturing capacity disappear.
And I think the impact that this waiver conversation can have now is that if we do have and want to build future manufacturing capacity, we need to think about making it as inclusive as possible and ensuring that, you know, we're really looking outward and not just inward. So there's a question that came up about what concrete actions can we do today. And I want to make sure that we're running up against the end of this conversation, which is sad because I think it's one of those conversations that is a moment in history where people will remember, you know, were they on the right side of this when this pandemic was raging? But before we sign off, I'd like to invite our participants and listeners and everyone here today to send a letter, to send your letter to Prime Minister Trudeau. Oxfam Canada has a call to action out, and the link will be put in the chat. And what that letter is asking is it's asking Prime Minister Trudeau to support the TRIPS waiver. And with the news that the US is supporting the TRIPS waiver, however limited their comments have been, we'd also love everyone watching live right now, to head to Twitter and let our Prime Minister and Minister of International Development and the Trade Minister, because, you know, we're going to loop everybody in on this, and let them know that you support the TRIPS waiver and that they should too, with our petition link. And the handles are there in our chat for folks to be able to, you can easily copy paste those handles. So I want to thank our fantastic speakers, Fatima Keller and Archana Rampur, for joining me today and for this really fantastic and super engaging conversation. I know I'm inspired, and I've been having this conversation with so many people since, you know, the first vaccine came out. So I know I'm inspired, and I felt like I learned a lot from each of you. And then, of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for this conversation about vaccine inequality. It shows how many Canadians are actually engaged in this conversation and care about what's happening globally and not just locally. Now, some of the solutions that we're advocating for, we believe are solutions that are going to get us, you know, some positive change. We've seen a slow uptake on the people's attitudes towards this waiver, and really have seen pharmaceutical companies and their behaviors as not in the public good. And I think that's really, really important to remember, that, you know, we need collective action and global solidarity. Thank you again for joining us, Archana and Fatima, and thank you everyone for being a part of our live this afternoon.
Thank you
very much
for having us. It was a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And you know, I'll just end with the last my last plea, I guess, is yes, please take the actions in the chat, but also call up your MP's office and tell them and tell their staff how you feel. I've already done that. I'm waiting for a response. And, you know, I hope other Canadians do the same. And then let's just remember that, you know, more vaccines for us does not have to mean less for people who are not as fortunate as we are.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more in the interest and spirit of global solidarity.
Me too.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.